Greeting Legionaries, this is General Lance with Lance's Legion, and I'm joined today by a very special guest, Mark from Pearl Snap Tactical. Welcome.
Hey, what's going on? What's up, boys?
Hey. So, you and I, we've met before, and I'll make sure to link in the description below, but, in our conversations, not simply online, but also just on back channels, so to speak, we talk about the role of spirituality. I mean, zoom out, forget about, real life, but even in the military, I was reading this article from the West Point, and it was this undergrad that was writing about how we need to revise the values of the Army to fit with modern warfare. And, to give him some credit, because I don't want to completely discount this kind of intuition, there's this great book, and, geez, I need to remember exactly the title, but effectively, it talked about the evolution of martial values in classical Greece, the transition from the Homeric to the classical era. And for those of you who don't know, the difference is that basically in the Homeric era, it was very one-on-one duels, personal. It's something that you'd have a lot of allusions to what you consider the Vikings to be. I mean, if you watch that TV show Vikings, a lot of it's about personal honor, personal duels, personalized self, and very individuated. As time went on and the city-state model rose and the need and the evolution of warfare changed, so, the change was that it went from a 1v1 type warfare to an emphasis on the phalanx, on the emphasis on teamwork. And so, similarly, for instance, just to give you an example, in the Homeric era, it wasn't seen as dishonorable to recuse yourself from a military situation. So for instance, if you're like in a 1v1 duel and you're getting like absolutely mogged by Achilles, for instance, there's no shame in running away, in hooking and jabbing and coming back and forth. And it's something very similar to, if you see videos of Papua New Guinea, basically these natives, the way that they skirmish with each other is very individuated. It's like pulling back and then every once in a while throwing in something and coming back. And obviously the Homeric era was a lot more kind of, organized and the martial education was a lot more fleshed out. So it wasn't quite that savage, if that makes sense, or that undeveloped, but there was a difference in emphasis. And where, for instance, Themistocles at the Battle of Leuctra, I believe, tied an anchor around his leg and said, from here I will stand, and if I die, I die. And it was an emphasis on courage of standing your ground, vice courage of necessarily going back and forth and keeping in the fight. So I understand this idea of developing values to fit the warfare of the time. However, this is where I disagree with the individual who wrote, and I won't even talk about this because I don't even want to give, air to this individual. But the point that I'm trying to say is he's trying to, make allusions to the fact, no, we're a progressive society, and that, warfare is like this evil it's just BS. It's just this communist revision of things. And so I'm really glad he came on, because what I would like to do is just talk about what are eternal values, right? And what are the eternal virtues? What are the things that actually are form a golden fiber throughout all the ages? And so regardless of the fact of the way courage was expressed, courage itself is always a value that stands the test of time. So does honor, so does all these concepts. Even though it's expressed differently, it's always present. And this person is wanting to do away with that. And I guess I wanted to ask you, because we're talking about, the pre-Christian era, obviously, and we want to talk about necessarily something that's more proximate culturally, especially because we come from an Anglo-Saxon background. The Anglo-Saxons, of course, were Germanic pagans, and I think I wanted to ask you, what's your view on necessarily the virtues? And I wanted to ask you, like, I don't know, what's your take on this kind of attempted reevaluation of values regarding the army, and what's your take on that? I guess.
I mean, I haven't read the article, so when we're done, you can shoot it to me. I'd like to look at it, but it just, at first blush, it just looks like the same old, like, postmodern kind of standpoint where, everything from the past, everything that anyone did in the past is wrong. It's dated. We've got to progress to the new thing. We need to destroy and deconstruct any type of hierarchy, and all that kind of stuff. And, I think everybody can take a scroll through their news feeds and see how everything's so messed up, and how, the America we grew up with is not the America we're living in now. And part and parcel is because we've abandoned a lot of these things that really, in my opinion, are ingrained on the cellular level. It's in our DNA. And the more you try to deny it, it's like that Jungian thing. The more you try to suppress it, the more it's going to come out and manifest itself in an unhealthy way. And that's what we're seeing. So I'm really glad you had me to come on to talk about this topic, because, my podcast, it's, I'm an infantry guy. And so most of my listeners want to hear about gear and training.
I like that.
Yeah. And we talk about that stuff, but I do try to kind of pepper in these type of things too. So, but I've never gotten into detail yet, like I think we're going to get into now. So I'm pretty excited. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thank you. No, thanks for coming on. And the reason why it's so important is because people, we talk about past and modernity, right? And this gives a frame of reference for the person who's not acquainted with these thoughts, that spend their time reading this stuff. We think of it as a temporal, situational value, right? And the funny thing is that there is no daylight between these two things. Ascribing a adjective which assigns values to time is completely wrong, because values are eternal, right? And what I mean to say is, like, humans, even on a biological level, haven't evolved in 10,000 years. We're effectively the same thing. Yeah. And so when people conflate technological or techne innovation with the change in the human body, first of all, on a scientific basis, those things do not correlate. And further, warfare is always, and life itself is always prosecuted by people, right? And people are human beings, and human beings, effectively, what do? They basically act in the world just as they are. And so when we say this, even just on a non-spiritual basis, there's just it doesn't hold water when it comes down to talking about, that somehow time changes values. It doesn't. It's the same. Right. You see all the time where people who stray from things that are time tested, quote unquote, is like, it always falls flat on its face. For instance, the Soviet Union is a great subject of study on my part. And the interesting thing is, for instance, when the revolution first happened by Lenin, he introduced, for instance, state-subsidized abortion. He abolished marriage. He, obviously instituted feminism on a radical basis. He introduced, in the military specifically, a different martial value, quote unquote, that most closely imitated the proletariat values in his eyes. And you saw at the beginning of World War II and even through World War I that their military efficiency was hinged on Tsarist officers that they had basically co-opted into serving, and so they needed it. And you saw, for instance, with abortion and the abolition of the family and feminism, that the fertility rate absolutely crashed. It was crazy. Right. And so the funny thing is, when Stalin came to power, he completely undid those things, right? Which is why modern Marxists decry Stalin as a fascist or whatever. But the truth is that you can't get away from nature. You can't get away from the truth. And Stalin realized this. He's like, well, pretty soon we're going to have no one. In 3 generations, everyone's going to be dead. And so if you kind of circle this back to modern warfare and stuff like that, all the values which were, I guess, the Soviets hinged their military efficiency during World War II were one and the same with the previous Tsarist regimes. And the funny thing is that now we see a lot of this Red Guard action, Pinkoism, happening in our learning institutions, specifically in the military, where we're trying to, or rather this foreign entity is trying to malign or warp these values. And what I'm concerned with, especially with the PRC, rising on the horizon, and, a number of enemies, both foreign and domestic, that are basically taking to the fore, that they are going to absolutely trounce us, because the military efficiency, which is ultimately derived from the individual, right, is going to be swept away. And so I just wanted your first opinions about exactly, what are those prime warrior values that stand the test of time? And in your opinion, what are the most important ones?
Well, I think, there's several of them, but so for the sake of our time here, I'll just pick up some big ticket items, and these are the ones that kind of come from the Germanic side of the house. That and we really are in the West. We are heir to the Greco-Roman and even more so the Germanic military ethos. And even when you had, when Rome was trying to conquer Germania and they never were able to. But then through Christianity, they did. But, there's a really good book called The Germanization of Medieval Christianity, where you can see that over time, the Germanic culture had as big of an influence on Christianity as far as the culture goes. Well, in how the doctrines were played out among the people as Christianity did on the Germanics. So it's very fascinating, and that's why you had the rise of, like, for instance, when people say, well, how is that possible? Well, Christianity really at its core, if you just pull the I've read the Bible several times from cover to cover, or I've read it at least twice, but I've studied many of the books, almost all of them in depth, just as a layman. And you, especially from the New Testament standpoint, if you strip away your host culture, your mindset to the degree that you're able to, it's a pacifist religion. It really is. I mean, and it just is. And so you can't get from first century AD in Judea, with the advent of Christianity, that version of Christianity, and then follow it 1,000 years later to the Knight Templars, to the Teutonic Knights, to the chivalric orders, who were also Christian, who had part of their, not only their culture, but it was their practice of their religion, of knighthood. They were intertwined. And you just can't go straight from A to Z like that. I mean, there's something that happened in between that. And it was the idea of the Mannerbund, or the Choreos from the Greek word, but Mannerbund in the Germanic, which was the warrior elite, and these band of warriors that followed a knight or a king or a warlord, and that had that culture with it that was imported into, and I'm not going to say Christianity, because you're not going to find it in the New Testament, you're not going to find it in the documents, but you find it in Christendom, the culture as it was expressed in Europe, right? And so that's what I mean. That's one example of how Germanization influenced Christendom, right? The culture. And so those big ticket items from the Germanic side that really come to light when you read the myths and the sagas and the legends, the idea of courage, that's a very Indo-European value. And it's a worldwide value. Any warrior culture is going to value courage for practical reasons, right? And then, the other one, honor, right? That's, from the Japanese samurai to, even in the Viking age or whatever, honor is very important. It's a universal virtue, but now how that gets applied, what that looks like is very different, in feudal Japan versus, arrayed into Anglo-Saxon England, right? I mean, that gets applied differently. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then particular amongst the Germanics was just a contempt for death, right? I mean, just an absolute contempt for death. And, And you can say that, oh, okay, well, that's because these guys are fighting, they're dying, they're watching their friends die, so they need that. But it's goes much deeper than that. It goes beyond just the warrior class. And like you and I were talking in our last transmission, I think when you came on my show, is that metaphysically everyone's a warrior. Like these myths, they talk about this warrior or this king, but that's a representation of you, right? Because life is a battle, and it doesn't matter if you swing a blade or if you're tilling the ground, right? Life is a battle. It's a struggle against nature. It's a struggle against invaders. It's a struggle against entropy within your own body physically as you age and everything. It is about, like Heraclitus said, war is the father of all things. And so these stories, these myths are templates for action, right? It's to help you navigate life's challenges, and they're eternal because they represent things. They're metaphors. And so they're applicable to everyone. And that is why, thousands of years later, we're still talking about the Iliad. We're still talking about, we're still talking about the myths of the Vikings and all that stuff. And that's why, Lord of the Rings very much follows that, because J.R.R. Tolkien was a, professor of Old English and Anglo-Saxon history, and he imported almost carte blanche, all of these myths and everything, and just rewrote them, but he stayed true. And that's why 100 years from now, people will still be reading Lord of the Rings, but they won't be watching Game of Thrones, right? As much as you might like. No, I got nothing against Game of Thrones. I watched the season except for the horrible last season, and really it kind of got played out after the first season, but that guy is not coming at it through valorizing the warrior mythos and the virtues. In fact, he's doing the exact opposite. He's attacking it. He's injecting modernity in it. And that's his right? That's his form of art. He's trying to take common things that we see in our society, and he's trying to, rephrase it into an alternate world, somewhere in the past or the mythic past and stuff like that. But the problem is he violates the rules and the understanding of myths and legends and the value that they have to the human spirit and the soul. And so while it may make for great entertainment, and same thing with that god-awful Vikings TV show on History Channel, while you might love, first season was decent, but while you might love those shows, like 100 years from now, no one will remember those. But we'll still be talking about Beowulf and Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and all that stuff.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And it's funny that you make the delineation between Christendom and Christianity. And, I mean, everyone kind of, especially when you do, biblical study, especially in my early years, you hear about, for instance, the New Testament. And this is why Protestantism had such a strong break and, I guess, raison d'etre against Catholicism at the time, and in part Orthodoxy in the East, is that there was, so in Catholicism there's this idea of tradition and scripture, and both, amend the other. And so the idea is that the Catholics, are very pagan. For instance, from saint worship to depictions of God in the Basilica of the Vatican, that is quite literally the most unchristian thing you can possibly imagine. But this goes further. For instance, in the Norse, when they were first Christianized in the 1100s, they had Norse clerics who would actually, no shit, go into battle and fight and kill men. And obviously you had people that were Normans, obviously, who were basically derived from the same people. There were, Norse who became Normans and then Latinized, whatever. And so Bohemond of Toledo, one of the greatest crusaders, you put the whole city to the sword, men, women, children, with blood running up to his knees. I remember this, and he'd say, kill them all. God will know his own, or something like that. And obviously, that is some pretty unchristian values to have. Especially if you go around and you take for face value the, prima facie, the New Testament. The New Testament is about turning the other cheek. The New Testament is about a lot of these things, and it's a new covenant. So when people try to you see this a lot. A lot of people try to cite the Old Testament. I'm like, my friend, the New Testament modifies the Old, and the New Testament is very clear about some very specific things. Yeah. But I'm not trying to get into Christians' guilds or anything like that. I'm not trying to denigrate that at all, because It's interesting that you talk about honor and the concept of honor. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are a lot of psychological studies that refer to cultures that are honor based versus
Mm-hmm.
guilt based.
Yeah, right.
We talked about this before, but the idea is that Christianity is a guilt based understanding, and it stems from Neoplatonism and basically the
Mm-hmm.
Greek kind of late classical philosophical schools of the individual having a soul, whatever. The point that I'm trying to make is that ultimately what happens with honor as a mechanism is that it's derived from the esteem of your fellows. And obviously, the
Right.
couriers, the war band, you're doing things in the good esteem of your friends. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
guilt based culture is about the good esteem of yourself in front of God, which is completely
Right.
irrespective. So it's completely individual. It makes you an atomic individual, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
whereas honor, which is really important, because if you think it in a military context, it's about having pride in your unit, and therefore
Mm-hmm.
your actions are commiserate and reflect upon your friends.
Right.
This is important in engendering unit cohesion, support,
Mm-hmm.
valor, whatever it may be, and it is one of those mechanisms that I think, obviously it's less so in the immediate aftermath of the Christianization of Germanic Europe, but it's
Mm-hmm.
something that increasingly gains pace over time because obviously
Right.
change is not instant, it's over time, it's
Mm-hmm.
incremental generation after generation. And
Yeah.
what do I mean by this? So for instance, it's funny that in in merry old England in the 1600s, there was this I think it's Christmas, Yuletide, and during Yuletide, I don't know if people know this, but people are just banging everyone, like having sex on the streets. It got so bad that the clergy was pressuring the king to make it illicit, and it's obviously clearly unchristian, and it's something that was brought from before Christian times and was sublimated into that society, which at that time was still, two things, right? The binding Christian philosophy that was slowly seeping in, but at that time was still, even late as 1600s, is still strongly pagan.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, what do I mean by this? How am I supposed to, the zoom out vision of things is that you're supposed to see that there's a delineation between certain values and warrior values. And
Mm-hmm.
if we're able to zoom forth to 1789, the Enlightenment, and of course
Mm-hmm.
remember that the communists come from the Jacobins, and they trace
Yeah.
their lineage from the Jacobins in 1789, the Commune of France, and ultimately their moral valuation is in effect a sublimation of Christianity made secular. So it's taken to
Mm-hmm.
the max. You know what I mean? So
Sure. Yeah.
concepts
Yeah.
such as we're all equal before the eyes of God were secularized into
Mhm.
we're rational and therefore all equal.
In the eyes of the state.
Precisely.
Yeah, right.
And so as time went on, and I remember Napoleon writing exactly about this, and when he was going through his reforms of the Napoleonic Army, he was facing a lot of these intellectuals who had joined up with the Revolutionary Army at first. So, when there was a time between the Revolution of 1789 and the time when he took power as emperor, right? And in that
Mhm.
time between, obviously, a lot of true believers in the Revolution, the French Revolution, the rationalist, whatever, almost supra-Christian values,
Mhm.
they were actually caustic to the military cohesion and effort because their values were directly antithetical to a warrior value. So honor concepts were completely considered irrational, quote unquote.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously this comes from it's really funny because when I was reading this article, you just see all the threads of history and the threads of kind of human voices that stretch epochs of time, and I'm sure that there were like emanations of this in the remote ancient antiquity. But
Yeah.
these were values that were held by the low peasantry, the slaves. These are slave values, right?
Yeah.
And so the interesting thing that I guess I wanted to bring, the challenges that we face today, and the reason why I went through this whole historical kind of context is because people think it's happening only now. People think
Right,
that the
right, right, right.
challenges are only now. And it's like, no,
Yeah.
my friend, this has existed since the beginning of time. I mean, if you go back to
Yeah.
the epics of Gilgamesh, same conflict arise. And
Mhm.
ultimately, I think the challenge is in our time is that there are no voices that talk about, not say different values, but better ones. And
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
and
Yeah.
so I don't know what your thoughts are that, but if you have any preliminary thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me, if you don't mind, let me just kind of roll into it. And so when you say like looking at these myths and things like that, especially when you come from a modernist standpoint, and we all do, right? We are in, whether you're Christian, you're Jewish, you're atheist, it doesn't matter. We're all products of modernity, right? You can't help it. Like you have a lot of values and assumptions that you come out of the chute with that are grafted into you at an early age that you don't have any control of, and you navigate on that template, right? Some of it is it's good, right? We have to interact in the society, but then some of it is negative, right? And which is reason why we're in the mess that we are. So, but we're so far removed from these things that sometimes we read these myths, and like if the Greco, we're reading myths about Zeus, and we're like, golly, man, this dude's like the Sky Father, and he's like sleeping around with everybody, and they're like, he's like disguising himself as an animal. What the heck, and same thing in the Norse myths, or you're reading Beowulf, and he's like talking about swimming, in the seas with these monsters for 3 days, and he's bright, and you're like, what is this stuff? And the thing is that even in the time, there was a Roman writer named Sallust who wrote a treatise on how to interpret myth. And he's like, look, dude, you can't read this stuff literal. Like, because that was one of the critiques in early Christianity is like, oh, your gods are so immoral. Look at what they're doing, this, that. And Sallust is like, no, dude, these are metaphors. These are trying to grab your attention. And sometimes just the fact that you see something that shocks the conscious is your cue that you need to pay attention and delve deeper, right? So in all religions in the past, and you can even make the argument that at least in the Middle Ages, Christianity was like this too. You typically have an exoteric form of the religion, which is just like, for Joe's six-pack, man, this is what we want to do. You're going to come to Mass on Sunday. You're going to observe the holidays. You're going to tithe. And as long as you, moral abstinence, you're good. You don't have to do anything else. But then there's an esoteric, right, which is a deeper meaning. And all the religions, kind of had this. And it typically was pursued by the higher caste, of folks, like your intellectuals, the priests, the warriors, and things like that. So that's your cue number one, that when you're reading this stuff and you're seeing things that like, God, man, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to, I'm not going to cheat on my wife. I'm not going to, it's like, no, dude, of course not. They didn't approve of that either. So let me kind of go through that. So the first thing you have to do, like when you come to these myths, the myths are entwined with religion, and some of these are foreign to us, but you've got to approach it from this standpoint. Christianity, and Islam, and any universalist monotheistic religion, that your culture, your society, your way of life, everything in the religion, it's all intertwined. They're not separate. Like even back in the days, like with the Germanics and the Viking Age and the Vendel era, they didn't have a word for religion. If you asked them what's their religion, they would not have any idea what you're talking about. There was only life, right? And so with religion, you were born into your religion ethnically. So if you were a Spartan, right, and so the gods were your divine ancestors. So if you were a Spartan, your divine ancestor was Heracles, and therefore also Zeus and the other pantheon, right? And the same thing with the Norse, right? Or the Germanics. Their divine ancestor would be, Odin, Thor, Freya, that pantheon. So that's the first thing. So it's not just you don't choose, you are born into the religion. So you don't convert. And even if you're not practicing the religion, like as well as, your neighbor, that doesn't matter. You're still in it. And that's very true with Judaism too, right? It still is today, right? You're born into it. All right. Now, you can also convert into Judaism too, but you don't convert into these religions. So that's number one. And then number two, like I already mentioned, the gods are your divine ancestors. So they're in your DNA. They are you to a certain extent, right? It doesn't mean you're a god, but you partake in the same essence of them, right? So it's the same substance, different degree, right? So you're on a lower form, but you partake in that divinity in a sense. And so that's why a lot of these religions weren't as concerned about salvation and the afterlife as much, because they're in the family, so to say. You are in the family. So then, therefore, the religious aspects, when it comes to morals, is not governed by your religion. The religious aspect, meaning your interaction with the divine, that's handled by your society and culture, right? So thousands of years ago, we're in small villages, we're in small communities where everyone relies on each other. You got a cobbler, you got a blacksmith, you got the farmers, and everyone is bartering and partaking in the festivals and the holidays and everything together. So it's the community is working together to just survive, right? So the thing is, if you're sleeping with the cobbler's wife and that gets out, right, dude, you're not going to last long in that village, or if you're short, or if you're making swords for someone, right, you're a skilled swordsmith and you're making weapons for someone, and to save and cut costs, you're not putting enough steel in it, right, or you're using shoddy material, and that sword breaks, when the dude's just practicing with it or whatever, that word's going to get out. And so your moral fiber, the things of, they had that too, of, you don't cheat on someone's wife. You don't lie to people. You don't hurt people within your own community. You don't get over on them. And in many of these societies, the penalties for doing that were much worse than what we have in our own society today. Much of this, you can pretty much get away with it. But there, you would be ostracized at best. At worst, you'd be killed. You'd be strung up in the village square, right? So the moral foundations, that sometimes people will look at the myths and the religious aspect, and they'll like, oh, these people weren't very moral. Well, no, on the contrary, they were in some ways just as moral, maybe more so in certain areas, because they had to be, right? It really wasn't a choice, right? So now then what's the purpose of the religious aspect of it, right? Even though they didn't have delineation, but for our purposes, we do. So we discuss it in that same. So the purpose, and I'm not an expert on this, but this is my take based on my research, is that the religion is there to bring you closer to the divine, to transcend your human limitations, right? That's ultimate, like to cultivate your will, right? And then to make you stronger, to make you more like them and their positive attributes, right? And then any negative attributes that come across in the myths are metaphors and are there for you to learn from, right? So that you do not get caught in those same vices, And oftentimes in these myths, these gods or these heroes oftentimes get burned for their indiscretions, and they learn from them, And we'll talk about that here in a second. So that's basically what it is. And then, so it's to help you just develop your strength, your courage, your force of will to contribute to not only for yourself, but to contribute to the community as a whole. Right. And the other thing is, in terms of cyclical time, right? Pre-Christians, they viewed time as cyclical, not so much linear. And so the idea is that it's the eternal return. So you're either going to reincarnate back into your family line to a certain extent, or at the very least, your bloodline has to continue. And so the things you do in this life will affect post, will outlast you. And so it was incumbent upon you to live a life of honor, to live a life of courage and integrity and strength, so that you can guarantee that your line lived on, because in a certain way, that's how you lived on too, right? And we are our ancestors. You are the culmination of decisions, battles, strife that your ancestors participated in and did well and prevailed in, or else you wouldn't be today, whether that was plague, starvation, cataclysms, war, whatever it is. You're here today because your ancestors stood up and faced those things, right? So that's the first thing you have to kind of get your head wrapped around, and it's easier said than done, before you approach any type of myth, right? Whether it's the Greco-Roman or Germanic or whatever. So that's the first thing. All right. So then you're going to come to these myths, and we'll get into some examples here in a second, but I'm just trying to set the stages.
Yeah.
So you have to understand that, like, we tend to look at religion, right? Because we come, whether, even if you're an atheist, you're in the modern society. So we've had 2,000 years of Christianity and solid monotheism. So the idea is that we have this scripture, we have this Bible, right? And it is set in stone. It is the word of God. Well, these myths and legends were even the poetic and the prose edda, right? That's the closest thing we have in the Germanics to a Bible, but it's not a Bible. It's not God breathed. It's not divinely, it's not the words of the gods to you. These are stories that are woven together by skilled poets, right, to impart metaphysical values of life, right? So that's the first thing you have to understand. So when you're dealing with poets, they're using metaphors. They're comparing things. They're saying this is like something else, right? And the Norse or the Germanics, I'm trying to get away from using the word Norse because it's a greater culture, but they also liked riddles, right? So these things were like, they didn't have Netflix, they didn't have cell phones, for entertainment. And so these things were meant to be thought provoking. These things were coming at a culture where a lot of the things that are foreign to us, they would have readily grasped. But even then in the stories, there's metaphors and hidden meanings that, especially for those that were really more into the esoteric side, it was their job to go and suss that out, right? Tease that out and solve the riddles and then go and operationalize that in their lives. So you have things like, when you're reading these myths, you have to keep in mind the symbolic frameworks, right? So they're metaphors for struggle, right? So they have core values that they're trying to impart that we're going to talk about here in a second, like honor, courage, bravery, things like that. They are templates for how you navigate challenges and overcome challenges that we all have in our life, regardless of our profession or occupation. And then also they have journeys, right? The hero goes on a journey, right? And that's a template for things that we all face in our life, right? And so these myths are templates, right? They're not something for you to go and reenact line by line like a recipe in a book, like you're baking a cake, right? Mm-hmm. But they're a framework for you to understand the parameters of the struggle, right? And what's required of you as the warrior to overcome that struggle, whether it's a POS boss that you got, that you're having a struggle, or financial hard times or setbacks, or, whatever it is, right? Those metaphors then become things like dragons, going into the unknown, like the dark forest, the brooding forest, right? And you will see that, especially in Germanic, there's always this delineation between what is known and what is unknown, right? So the village, the community, is the known, that is the known world. And then the unknown is what's beyond that, in the forest or out on the high seas. That's where the monsters are. That's where the chaos is. And it's the job of the warrior is usually often tasked with a mission, right? To go and get this magic sword or this magical treasure, or there's something, but it's not in the community. It's not in the known. It's in the unknown. And that's really a metaphor for yourself, right? So there's the known, the data, the information, the skills, and the experiences that you have, that right? And then there is the things that are outside your comfort zone. There's maybe things within your subconscious. You have subconscious obsessive compulsive behaviors, and you don't know where it's coming from, but that's locked somewhere deep in your psyche that's unknown. You don't know exactly how to get to it, or some people are just scared to even venture, right? Some people won't take that hero's quest. They won't go forward, right? And that's where the Grail myths and everything are all about that too. So it's venturing into, from a Jungian perspective, like going into the dark side of the soul, not dark and evil. It's dark as an unknown, so it can be read on several levels, like you against someone else, right? In a conflict, or you against yourself. Right. And I've got some examples for that. So that's kind of what the myths are there. So when you come across something that you're like, oh man, that's not very moral, or that's not, you shrink back. It's not trying to teach you, don't lie to people or be a good person. We all know that. We don't need a story to tell us that, right? We just know that by growing up. Hey, if I lie to people, if I'm a piece of shit to people, life's not going to go good for me. Eventually karma's going to catch up with me, right? I don't need someone to tell me that. So these stories, then, when you see things that might be shocking to the conscious, that's the story's way of you to wake you up to engage with it, right? So
Yes.
that's my preface before I get into those three values that we talked about. So I kind of went on a long time. Do you have anything?
No, I'm absolutely engrossed in this. I think it's interesting because, I mean, just as an aside, I think it's interesting because most people, they don't even, it's like an iceberg, right? Your consciousness is like the tip of an iceberg, but you don't realize that the majority of your thinking process, even the ones that are subconscious, most of them, most of your actions, your personality, everything all comes from thousands of generations of experience and evolution and of a certain type of life. And I think this gives context to everything else, because especially when we come from a very Christian society, regardless, even if you're atheistic, the thing is that the values that you have and the feeling of the world that you experience is very Christian. And so which obscures, of course, something that goes way deeper and for far longer than simply this relatively, in the advent of history, new philosophy, religion, whatever you want to call it. It's something that gives people context, and I think it's so important because when you're on the battlefield, like when you have self-doubt, is probably the worst thing a warrior can have, is that anxiety, that self-conscious, like not knowing what is this for, and it completely shatters morale. And I think this is probably the most important element of this, is that if you understand where you come from, where you're going, and where you will go after your death, it gives meaning and purpose and fortitude to the individual that's living and experiencing, especially in high-intensity combat. I mean, it's absolutely important, and it's one of those things that, like I said, going back to the Soviets, who were obviously super material, atheistic kind of individuals, they saw that there was an important need for people to believe in something. I mean, if we're taking from their perspective, from an atheist perspective, they're just looking at this mechanistically. They're just thinking, okay, like, even though, quote unquote, it's not true, these people need to believe it. Most people need to believe in something higher just to be able to, like, to be able to, exist and be part of that. And so much so, it's a funny little story, but the early Soviet army and the general staff, the Stavka, there was this guy that suggested to Stalin that the state religion should be dedicated to the Slavic god of war, because that it wasn't the Marxist-Leninist value wasn't giving enough impetus to the soldiers. And he obviously got killed for that. But the funny thing is that there is this recurring like need, metaphysical, spiritual need.
It's in the DNA, man. It's in the DNA. And no amount of banning toy guns or, trying to get your boys to play with Barbie dolls or anything is, you're going to destroy the kid for sure, but you're never going to stamp it out, man. That stuff is just waiting to come back, especially if you kind of subscribe to that Jungian motif of, whatever you suppress it's going to come back and bite you if you don't deal with it. And, the whole point with these myths are to give you a template to deal with that stuff and to bring it out, to face it, and then incorporate it into your life in a healthy way to make you healthy and whole, So I don't know where to start with all this, but I'll start with let's just start with the idea of I don't know, like contempt for death, right?
Yeah.
And right. So and a lot of these kind of blend together, right? I could any of these examples I used to talk about courage. I could talk about honor, because they're really inseparable. Can you really have honor if you don't have courage? You know what I mean? Can you be courageous? I'm not talking about brave, but courageous if you're not an honorable person. I mean, it's hard, right? But I'll just kind of go stream of consciousness, but to give examples of these. But there's an example of like Beowulf, right? Beowulf was something that like all your smart AP English read in high school. I wasn't one of those kids, but I remember listening to all my friends who were bitch about, Beowulf. It's so boring. It's hard to read. And it is, because it's written, the story itself is thousands of years ago, but the Beowulf iteration is, at least 1500, maybe even more, older. Right. But it's this idea of, Beowulf, for those people who don't know, sometimes these things can be hard to read, but then once you get acclimated to the writing style, they weren't writing like, John Grisham novels back then, right? So the writing style was different. But once you get acclimated, these are beautiful stories that can really send you spiritually into a new level. But anyway, so Beowulf, right? So he's from he's a northern Germanic kind of climate, even though it's written in Old English, but you have to remember that it was the Jutes, the Anglos, the Saxons from northern Germany that invaded, Britannia, right? And they brought that culture with them, right? So they're telling tales that their ancestors told around the campfire. So you got Beowulf, who is this like total Chad, total beast, and so anyway, there's this king Hrothgar, right, who has this hall, and it's being haunted and terrorized by this monster named Grendel, right? And so nobody can face this monster, right? And this is a clan of warriors, but none of them, Grendel's in there. He's just crushing these dudes night after night. So they send out the call for Beowulf, and Beowulf comes with his Mannerbund, right, his retinue. Right. So he comes and he's like, yeah, I'll fight Grendel, man. And then all of a sudden, so what he does is he tells everybody, hey, go to sleep. Like everybody go to sleep. And then he's up on watch. They're like, oh, what are you going to fight him with? He's like, man, I'm not going to fight him with anything. I'm going to kill this dude with my bare hands. And you're like, what? Where are we going with this? Like, this is ridiculous. Right? This dude's a monster and you're just going to fight him with his bare hands. So that's the first thing that might turn people off. But again, just like Saul has said, when you see something that shocks the conscious, that's a cue for you to pay attention. Like, why is he so dead set on stripping himself of his honor and his weapons, right? Is the fact that he realizes that the man-made weapons, the artificial tools, are not going to help him in this conflict, right? Because the conflict is greater than that. It's not. This monster represents something more than just a foe or an adversary, right?
It's like metaphysical almost. It's like,
so he can't rely on something outside of himself. It's got to come from him. So he downgrades his arm. He downgrades his kit. So anybody who's been in a JRTC rotation in August will love the fact, I get to take my kit off, right? So he takes his kit off, lays his sword aside, and here comes Grendel, man. And then Beowulf's ready for him. And they have this big altercation. They're just trashing the mead hall. And all of a sudden, like, Beowulf rips his arm off, right? He just tears his arm off, and Grendel screaming. And there's a lot of attention, which is really interesting, that it talks about things from the pain and the suffering that Grendel's feeling, which is something that, and I didn't make any of this stuff up. I've read other scholars and stuff that talked about that, but it's kind of one of the first times that it kind of gives some type of humanity to a monster, and that's very strange too, right? Because this guy is evil. He's evil incarnate. So it's like, why is it trying to do that? So again, your second clue, pay attention. So anyway, I think if I remember the story right, it's been a while since I read it. Grendel, mopes off and he's screaming and everything, and they hang his arm up. Everyone's drinking beer and, partying and stuff. And then Beowulf knows this guy's going to come back, right? He's going to come back with a vengeance, and he does. And then at that time, again, Beowulf just takes it to him, man. Just totally crushes him, kills him, takes his head off. They're parading it around, and then everybody's partying and stuff. Well, you think it's over, but it's not, because Grendel's got a mom, and she's even worse than he is. Right? And you're like, what? Now, hold on. Again, your second clue. This dude's going to go fight a girl. Like, this is a warrior society, ultra masculine. And now he's going to fight a female monster. Like that, what? Wouldn't it, if anything, wouldn't it be the other way around? But no. Right. And so what he does, so let's just stop right there, right? What all is this? And you really need to read the story, but the whole point is that really, my interpretation of it is that Grendel in itself is like a mirror to Beowulf. They're evenly matched, right? But it's the darker side of Beowulf, right? Because although these guys did brag on their feats of heroism and stuff, there was this expectation, like, it's got to be well grounded, and you can't be too full of yourself. Like, it's important to be brave, it's important to be courageous, but you can't be reckless, right? Mm-hmm. Right? You can't let that. You can't you can't let your success, you can't read your own and believe your own press, as we would say in today's age, right?
Just interrogative here, just a question, because it is interesting that you brought that up, that motif, and it's like, I just think to myself, finding a woman, like, that's like no go, like, you know what I mean? I remember, like, I don't know, you revealed to this. I mean, a guy goes to prison for beating someone, like a woman. That guy gets annihilated in prison, right?
Oh yeah.
I'm thinking to myself, like, this is kind of strange. So, do you mind like explaining that a little bit further?
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to get that when I get to Grendel's mom, because you'll see that in the edits too with Thor. He spends a lot of time fighting ogres and female giants too. I mean, male giants as well, but you're like, it's talking about him like crushing the backs and the spine of these like female ogres and stuff. And you're like, what is this? Huh? Like, this is like Thor is like the man's man, the striker, the thunder god. And like, he's bragging about like just totally trashing these like female entities. Like, that didn't make it like from a warrior culture, and plus we're raised, you don't hit women and stuff like that. So it's like, where is this coming from? Are these guys just barbarians? No, it means something very important. Right. So you again, that's why I gave the preface earlier. You have to think about it in the milieu in which it was written. So in a certain extent, Grendel kind of represents the darker side of Beowulf himself, like the unchecked passions, right? The recklessness, the fighting for self, right? Remember, we talked about the ties of the community, being solely for self, being completely self-engrossed and everything. And so when you look at the descriptions of Beowulf and everything, and then you match it between what it's saying about Grendel and the anguish that he's suffering and the hatred he has and his selfishness and his greed and everything, that would be a form metaphysically of Beowulf if that was left unchallenged, if he doesn't face it. And that's why he couldn't do it with his armor and the weapons. He couldn't do it with it's that thing of like, no one can do your push-ups for you, right? You can't rely on some hack. You can't rely on someone else being able to come in and do it when you're confronting things about yourself, right? You can run from it, right? You can try to intoxicate yourself, right? You can stay drunk. You can try to avoid the confrontation through pleasure and distraction, which is what most people in modern society do. But to face it, you have to face it alone, by yourself, without the aid of anything, right? Anything external, right? So ultimately, it is you against yourself, right? And that's why that story is so poignant.
Yeah, that's interesting because, I mean, Jung talks about this in this concept, like integrating the shadow, right? And the idea of basically, it's not sublimating, so much of a human experience is suppressing things that give us pain. And obviously our shortcomings are painful to even admit. And it's interesting that you make that, like, illusion because it's true. Like, it's more, like, yes, we have battles with nature, with other people, but it really is the whole campaign of life is within. And it's interesting that this motif elucidates that in that way. It's just, I don't know, I'm sorry if I kind of interjected here. It's just interesting because it's like Jung talks about this, about basically overcoming, not necessarily destroying, I guess, in Jung's sense, but incorporating the positive elements of this in the sense that it evokes what's best in you. And it seems like Beowulf, it's precisely because Grendel and his mom exist that Beowulf is a better man, because he's able to, like, integrate, or it provokes greatness. The conflict provokes him to overcome himself. So that's so interesting. Wow.
And if you I've got other examples, so I didn't get too deep into the story. People need to go read it because we got to bring you back,
man. We got to bring you back. This is awesome. Okay.
Because prior to that, when he comes into the Hrothgar's hall, people are sizing him up, and there's another warrior there, and they start shit talking each other and everything. They start kind of comparing each other's resume, and Beowulf is kind of running off at the mouth. The difference is he can back it up, right? But the problem is he's doing it in a way that he kind of you could make the argument like he's dishonoring some of the other warriors in the hall, which is a total no-go, right? So it's that idea that, okay, he can talk it and he can back it up, but the problem is he's getting a little too full of himself, at this hall. And then that's when Grendel comes, right? So it's like, here's a guy that's got a big blind side and he's got a character flaw that he's not aware of, right? And then all of a sudden, here comes Grendel. And now he has to deal with it, right? Yeah. So he deals with it, but he's not done yet, right? So he's had the initial battle, and that's Grendel. So he's faced himself, but he really hasn't reunited the spirit with the soul. And that's where Grendel's mom comes in, and also Thor. So I'll hit that one off at the same time. So because Thor really is, and again, you read these myths and legends on several different levels. They don't just mean one thing. They have it's a multiplicity of meanings. And one thing that Thor's mom is the earth. Her name is Jord, right? So he's often referred to as the son of the earth, the defender of Midgard, or defender of earth, right? So that's why he was so popular, right? And most striker gods they defend the earth, right? So anyway, he's the son of the earth, right? He's like our brother, and he's representative of man. So you see Thor going through a lot of the same trials that we do, and I'll get those in a second. But the one thing I bring him up, like Beowulf, is Beowulf in a sense is reenacting the motifs of Thor in this, or he's about to. And so we are to reenact these things too, not physically, but metaphysically in our lives as well, right? Right. So he's our forerunner, so to say. So anyway, so mother, well, let's set that up first. So what they say is, oh man, Grendel was bad news, but his mom's 10 times worse, dude. So now you just kicked over a hornet's nest, because now we're all going to die, man. Because this chick is going to come in.
Beowulf knew he fucked up.
Yeah, he really stepped in it. You really stepped in it. So what they decide is, I think, man, if I remember, I think she comes through and she like totally smokes a bunch of people too. It's been a while since I've read it, but fast forward, they go to her lair, right? So Beowulf comes to Hrothgar, right? Because that's the enemy within, right? Now Beowulf has to go on a journey of discovery. So that means, right, what we said, going from the community, from the known, now he has to venture into the unknown. And this is a place nobody wants to go, right? Because it's scary, and that's where the monsters are, right? It's one thing if the monster comes in into your day-to-day life, you deal with that. But it's one thing when struggles and trials are forced upon you, like Grendel, but to go after it for your own betterment, right? To aid in your own self-becoming, that's something that a lot of people aren't willing to do, right? Right? A lot of people just want to play safe in their life, right? Yeah. They don't want to start that new business. They don't want to ask that girl out. They don't want, because they're scared, they're afraid. They don't want to face the dysfunctional behaviors in their life, because what that might uncover and the change that might mean to them, right? So now he's rolling up. All right, so they go to her lair, but the problem is it's underwater, right? And so boom, all right, so this chick is like some sea hag, thing. So her lair is like in an underground cave below the water. And so all the warriors are like, and they can look down in the water and they can see these monsters, like it's guarded by monsters. That's another thing in these Germanic motifs. You have to do a descent into the underworld, right, to get the prize. And it's usually guarded by other monsters that you have to defeat along the way, right? And those are symbolic of other things that we're not going to get into here. So anyway, he's looking down into the water, and he's expecting some of these guys to go with him, and they're like, "No, dude, they're like, we shouldn't even be here. So we're done. We're not going underwater." Yeah, exactly. They're like, "Yeah, man, we support you from back here." Yeah. Right? So he's like, "All right, man." So he makes his descent. He swims underwater, deals with these monsters and stuff, and he gets into her lair. There she is, and he's got to confront her, and then he kills her, right? And so what that represents, and so in Germanic society, usually when you have a representation of one thing that's positive and that's good, you have darker, like an opposite. So in Germanic pantheons, you have these female goddesses that are beautiful, of light and stuff like that, and then you have ogres and giantesses that sometimes, not all the Jotuns is the actual translation, right there. That's a word for devour. So there's a negative aspect. They're destructive in nature. And usually the female part is the other side of you, the feminine aspect, and it's of your soul, right? And everyone's like, what? Yeah, everyone has a male feminine aspect of their spirit and soul, right? Or that's the understanding of the ancients, right? And so, and we're not talking like the gender issues. It's again, it's the known and the unknown, right? So
anima, I understand.
Yeah, exactly. Like what Jung would say, yeah, the anima and animus. And so, the masculine part again is the known, like that your skills, your abilities, the knowledge you have, and then the unknown, like your intuition, the things that are about yourself that are not readily.
Almost.
Yes. Yeah. And that's kind of the more feminine side. And so the job is to bring this together so that you're a fully functioning human being. And so when you see these heroes that stand at the precipice of a cave or the water where they go into it, that's descending into the underworld, and that is a metaphor for descending into your subconscious, right? It's you're going deep and diving into where your subconscious is. Hang on just a second, I gotta let this dog in.
No problem.
I got 2 dogs. They're both 8 pounds, and neither one of them will take no for an answer. So she wants in, she's going to get in. Okay. So anyway, so this water, right? Because you can't see through it. It's the unknown. And so now he descends, and that's a metaphor for descending into yourself and taking an inner journey, right? And so the female is representative of your soul aspect. So as the male is the spirit, the consciousness, but the feminine aspect is the part of your soul, right? That you just don't readily see, you don't readily communicate with, or you have a hard time communicating. And the goal is then to face that. So oftentimes, like in the other Germanic myths, and the way you do that, the first step is you can't be fearful. It takes courage to do it. So a lot of times, like in the Sigurd stories, and I'll get back to Beowulf, but like, you'll find these warriors usually have a Valkyrie, right? That's assigned to them. And the Valkyrie, and the job of the warrior is to make connection, make contact with this Valkyrie. And oftentimes what happens is they get married, or they'll have sex, they get married. And then from then on, the Valkyrie then teaches him wisdom. She'll teach him about the runes. She'll advise him or whatever. But but the way she's usually, the way to get to her, he usually has to wake her up, right? Because she's sleeping. So when Sigurd finds Brunhilde, right, this Valkyrie, she's guarded, instead of animals, she's guarded by this ring of fire, these flames that no one can pass through unless you're bold and brave. And Sigurd's the only one who can do that, right? So he rides and jumps over the flame, right? So he faces himself. He summons the courage to go into the unknown, and then there he finds Brunhilde sleeping, and then he wakes her up. They get married, and that's an example of you making connection with your fate soul, right? And so it doesn't, and you always have those stories of folklore of like the dude that finds the ugly hag and she wants him to kiss her, and he's like, no, dude, you're totally ugly. And then so she'll, puts a curse on him, but then he ends up kissing her and she turns into this like beautiful princess.
Right.
That's it's the same thing. It's the same thing. And so that's why the other thing, like was with Thor crushing, these female giants, or Beowulf crushing Grendel's mom, right? So it's not the marrying of the soul, but it is destroying those negative aspects, the darker sides, right? It's facing that. So that story, that motif comes across in 2 ways. It's either you wake up the Valkyrie, the beautiful princess, you marry her, right? Now you're a fully functioning warrior, or you go deep and you eradicate that negative aspect of yourself.
Huh. God damn, Mark, you're gonna you sent me for a tailspin here, because it's awesome, and you think about it. And I was actually just reading Junger War's Inner Experience, and it's almost like an emanation of what we're talking about, because many people, they think the myths, even the Bible, for instance, they think it's this remote, distant thing, and really what it is describing a mental state, your spiritual state. And so many people, they think that going out into the world, and they're concerned of failing. I think that's the biggest fear, and I think the most important thing about spirituality and understanding is that it's not necessarily about winning per se, though I do expect you guys to win. What I'm trying to say is that the outcome of your action is not the purpose of your life.
It's the action itself, and that's all eternal. And so, obviously, in the motif of Beowulf, it's precisely that you're talking. Yes, it's about a quest. It happened for real, okay? But we're talking about a quest that actually is about self-overcoming, and that is always within. And the reason why I wanted to impart this story with Mark is because when you're out, and let's say there's probably going to be a war on the horizon, you know, I don't want you to consider victory in the sense of what happens out there in the material world, but rather have you secured victory within. And this is a motif that Evola goes and talks about, is that really it's about the spiritual victory within. In death or triumph, it's the victory that you're pursuing within. And we all know the opposite. Whereas to be a coward, to be faithless, to have lack of integrity, you know, to be an individual, is a kind of spiritual death within oneself. And you can feel it. You know it's wrong. Like, you don't even need someone to tell you that. You just feel gross and disgusting with yourself. And so, obviously, I guess the warpath is really what we're talking about, the spiritual warpath of self-overcoming, the conflict, the warrior within, overcoming the weakness within. And I was talking about this in actually a recent podcast that I kind of just monologued about the will, and about how within all of us there is the motif of the enemy. And I talked about this in a capital E. I always get made fun of it for it, but people don't understand the reason why I capitalize it is because it's a concept. It's an archetype. And you know, if we were able to make the illusion with Beowulf being the hero, the champion, the positive aspect of your soul, the overcoming, the enemy is, you know, obviously it's Grendel, it's his mom, it's the trolls, it's the enemy within. And so ultimately, I think why we're talking about this, Mark, I think just to bring it full circle here, because we're in the last minutes of the transition, we have to go on patrol, unfortunately, Mark. It's our turn. But what I would say is, and what I'm trying to impart on you, Legionaries, is the idea that regardless of what happens, you know, obviously do your best to win at life, do your best to win in the conflict, in the fight. But it was never about winning the fight per se. It's about winning the war within. And if your life stops at 18 or it stops at 89, remember that it's always a quest within. And Mark, if it's okay with you, I'd like to bring you on for a sequel to talk about the two other elements which we're talking about. So today we talked about contempt for death and the reason why, but I think we wouldn't do it justice if we didn't have a fully fleshed out session, if that's okay with you, Mark.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, let me just wrap up Beowulf real quick, and then we'll save the other stuff for others. Because I wanted to talk about Ragnarok, you know, and Valhalla. You know, it was like, oh, Ragnarok, and most people, I mean, in my opinion, just again, they're reading it on the surface level, which is fine. It's an awesome story, but they're missing out on, you know,
this element.
What it
exactly?
Yeah. So all right, so he goes in there. So he's faced himself with Grendel, you know, he's faced and he's conquered his soul, so to say, or at least integrated the soul, right? And he's tamed it. So that would be, you know, he's tamed the negative aspect of his soul, right? So now when he comes out, like, he comes back and he journeys, and now he's changed because of it, right? Now he's a different Beowulf. He was always a badass, but it wasn't about that. Now he's inwardly, he's much wiser now. He has more understanding now. And that's something that we all have to transition to as we get older, right? It's transition from that warrior to sage, you know what I mean? Type thing. So in the story, you know, spoiler alert, I'm going to go ahead and talk to the end. You have to read the whole story because there's other, you know, other adventures and stuff in there. So he becomes king in his own right. So now he's ruling his kingdom. Everybody loves Beowulf because he's wise, he's smart, he's a good leader. He looks out for his people, he's generous, you know, all this kind of stuff. And then here comes the dragon, right? Here comes that perennial force that's in so many stories, right? And so now there's this dragon that's, you know, terrassing in the countryside, and he's just wrecking people. And then all of a sudden he goes into a barrow where that's where they buried the dead. So you see the motif with the death, which is the subconscious, right? Again, you can see once you see them repeatedly. You can't unsee them, right? So anyway, everyone's like, oh my gosh, who's gonna ride out? And you know, the warrior's like, hey, we'll take care of this. And Beowulf, even though he's 50 years older, right? He's like, no, he's like, I got to do this because I have to do this. So he gets his retinue, the kid up, they ride out to the barrow. And now, you know, they're at the entrance right there. And he's with him and his nephew and then all these like brave warriors. And these guys aren't like the extras on the like the 1960s Star Trek, right, where they beam down on the planet and the dude in the red shirt's always going to be the first one to die because you've never seen him in the show before. You know what I mean? He's just like just there for fodder. I mean, these guys aren't just stand-ins. These are worthy warriors, right, and courageous Champions. And everything in their own right. Champions, yeah, exactly. So he rolls in, and they're having once again, they're having none of it. They're not going into this cave, man. They're just not going to do it, and ultimately they can't, because again, it's about facing yourself, right? And so other people can't do this for you. You have to be the one that goes in and does it. And so there he is, but now he's a different Beowulf. Before, when he faced Grendel, prior to that, it was about himself and his own aggrandizement. But through his trials, he matures. And this one is for his people. This one is for the love of his people and his community, that he puts himself out there when he doesn't have to. Like Grendel, like that's why he was called, right? He shows up. There's no one else going to take on Grendel, right? Same thing with his mother. Other people had a chance. They weren't going to do it. But like this dragon one, other people would be willing to do it, but he's going to be the one that goes and does it. I'm not just for glory, right? Because that's part of the motif too, but it's like ultimately when you move, you have to be the one that does that. And so he goes in, he gets the first lick, man, but it overcomes him. He gets a mortal wound as well. And then his nephew jumps in there, and his nephew helps him and helps him deliver the final blow. And that's so important to the story, because then that goes back into that, what we were talking about with legacy and everything, is that the nephew has learned from Beowulf. He's watched Beowulf fight his own battles, and now he's standing toe to toe, and he is the heir to Beowulf now, right? Yeah. And so that thing with the the dragon guarding the treasure, right? It's the greed, it's the complacency, it's the inability to change, it's the rigidness, and it's the ugly, destructive force that is within, right, that you have to do battle with. And so that's what he does. He smokes it. He dies, but all the heroes die in these legends, but that is just a motif for them reaching maturity. That means that they've the death. They've fought well. They got a noble death, which is what all warriors want, right? But the noble death, but that is the summit of his evolution, right? So that he has lived his full life, and he has ended his life greater than when he started. And that's what we all want, right?
Yes.
And so now, in a sense, he is reincarnated. He's made anew through the life of his nephew. And the thing is, it's the same thing with us, right? It's not just that we physically die, which we all are going to, but it's like when we struggle with these things. Yeah. Spoiler alert. We all die in the end. But they transcend, and you transcend, and you become a different person, and you assume a new identity, or you should, and that's the thing, right? When you have the choice in how you overcome these obstacles and these challenges, right? You grow from them, or you don't, you remain static, right? And so Beowulf doesn't remain static. He changes. And even in his death, now he is in a sense reborn through his nephew, right? Not physically or literally, but metaphorically.
It's interesting that you say that, because it's whether it's father and son, uncle and nephew, or you're an NCO bringing up your boot. It's the same continuity of life. It's the idea that we're born onto this world, that we have a certain ownership, a duty, a mission, right, to fulfill, to fully flesh out oneself. And obviously, as you get into your later years, it's about imparting those values as a continuity to the next generation. And obviously, I'm not as well versed in the Nordic sagas, etc., or the Germanic sagas, excuse me. But this motif you experience with Hercules. Hercules didn't become Hercules by himself. He became so because he had a mentor. And so, and this is why, for instance, Odin is so important, because he's not merely the all-seeing, he has a raven one-eyed, seeking knowledge, but he imparts wisdom. He is the traveler, the unknown, and this is why I think it's so important here at Lance Legion. Like, persona aside, just for real, like, I think it's so important, and the reason why I'm reaching out to, individuals such as Mark, great leader, and others as well, is because I want to make sure this kind of wisdom is imparted on you, so that way you take ownership as a leader, so that way you are able to
impart these things that are learned from time eternal, and so that way no one can dissuade or obfuscate the spiritual mission. Because there will be people that were trying to cut your heels, to undermine your self-confidence, to undermine your purpose, and we're here to tell you and reaffirm you, is like, no, you have a purpose, you have a mission, you have obligations, you have a duty to ownership and leadership, and this is exactly the start. And Mark, I apologize, Sergeant Barnes is knocking at the the command post here. But what we'll do is we'll bring you back, and we're going to talk about Ragnarok in the next episode, in the next transmission, and we're going to go ahead and delve into a little bit deeper. Does that sound good to you, Mark?
Absolutely. Just for a parting shot real quick, I'll say if anyone's questioning like the vitality and the value of actually delving into these things and living these things, just keep in mind that the Germanic tribes, by the end of the Viking Age, had set foot as far west as Vinland or Canada, all the way to the Middle East, and had exploits all the way between, because they internalize these principles, these concepts, and these values. So they're incredibly powerful. And I think in some sense, there's why modernity fears us looking at those things, because of how potent the potential it is for each individual to become. So I'll just end it with that.
Absolutely.
And give you thanks for having me on.
Well, yes, sir, absolutely, and it's always good to have a good NCO given the discipline.
Yeah.
But just before we go on the end of the transmission, do you have any kind of projects you're working on, or anything that you'd like people to follow you on, so that way they can get that wisdom firsthand?
So you can always follow me at Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast. I'm on Apple, I'm on Spotify, all that stuff. But we're on Substack. That's our home. So that's where you can get the show notes, the transcripts, as you listen to it as well. So that's where I would point everybody. And then training, or what I call the rating season, is upon us, which means, we do a lot of tactical training and live events. So that's at veritasdefense.com. So if you leave those links below so people can access them. And I'm on X, and you can link up with me anywhere there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Sergeant Barnes, for kicking us in the ass. We got to go on patrol here together, and so thank you so much, Legionaries, and this is General Lance in the War Room, signing off.